Good morning, East Coast International Church. How we all doing today? All right, I'll try to ask one more time. How we all doing today? Awesome, that's what I like to hear. It's great to be with you all today. Just wanted to say a quick thank you to Pastor Kirk for giving me the opportunity to speak to you guys as we continue our series, Hidden Figures. But first, my name is Jesse. I'm one of the pastors here at East Coast International Church. I oversee all things media, all things El Centro, our building next door, and also all things youth. Actually, tomorrow I'm heading to camp with 8 of our high schoolers. Yeah, celebrate, but don't. You know what I mean? It's going to be a week of no sleep, smelly teenagers, and bugs that are way too big for my liking out in New Hampshire. So, but on a serious note, please be praying that our teens are safe, that they have fun, and that they encounter Jesus in a mighty way. I hate the camping experience because of all of that stuff, but it's the place where God really pushed me to want to be a pastor, so I can't hate on it too much, you know? So I guess we'll enjoy it. But of all those things, my greatest title in life, I gotta say, is being husband to my amazing wife, Juana. We can clap for her. And father to our daughter, Alora. It's actually been such a fun journey with my wife, being able to watch Alora grow up. Also slightly depressing too, because it's happening so fast. She's walking now. She's talking, or at least she thinks she's talking, but we'll have these like back and forth banters. I don't even know what's happening, but you know, she has a fierceness about her, and she's just a curious little girl just exploring everything. We're at the stage now, though, where we can't even look away for a second because she's always up to something. Like, one of her newest likings right now is just to carry any object she can get her hands on. At first, it was like normal stuff, right? Like, she would carry her toys, her cups, like things that actually made sense to have in your hands. But then she started to challenge herself a bit. She started taking things she should be rolling and just picking it up and walking away, or whatever heavier toy she can find and just dragging them across the living room just because she could. And now we're at the point where if something can be moved, she's determined to try to be the one to do it. There was a day she pulled one of her blue toy bins off of a shelf, and she dumped every toy from it on the floor. And thinking nothing of it, Juan and I were just talking, letting her do her thing. And then all of a sudden, we noticed that this giant blue bin was moving. Not because it was floating, but because it was this tiny 1-year-old underneath it trying to carry her way to the other side of the living room. Her back was arched. Her entire face literally disappeared behind the bin. If there was a baby Olympics, this is what she was training for. I have no idea why she was trying to lift that. We laughed, but we quickly realized that we're now at a point where we only not have to teach her the things she shouldn't touch, but now we also have to teach her what she should be carrying and shouldn't be carrying. Because the last thing we want for her is to hold on to something that could eventually crush her, right? You know, I mean, kind of got to be good parents a little bit. But one of the things I keep finding in these moments that I have with her is every time these things happen, it's almost like I'm getting a picture of more serious conversations that I'll eventually have with my daughter. Like one time, I was in a cafe working on stuff, and I grabbed something from my pocket, and I realized I had one of her hair ties in there. It was cute because I had done her hair that day. And then I quickly realized that there's going to be a day where I no longer find hair ties in my pocket. So then I got depressed because she's going to be like, Dad, don't do my hair. You do a terrible job. Like, you know, things like that. But in this moment, after carrying the bin, I had another one of those moments. Because one day, I realized we're going to have a similar conversation again. But it wouldn't be about the dangers of her carrying blue bins. It would be talking about the dangers of carrying things like worries, pressures, things like expectations and disappointments, and the responsibilities and overall weight of life. Like, those are tricky things, right? Because sometimes we don't always know we're carrying it. They're not always obvious. But we do know that if we hold on to the wrong things long enough, sooner or later, they're going to begin to crush us. If we're honest, many of us know exactly what it feels like to walk through life with weight on your shoulders. The regrets of yesterday, the expectations of today, the fears of tomorrow, the pain of our past, the anxieties of our future, and the pressure to just be and do enough. If we could just visualize everything we've probably found ourselves carrying, some of us would look just like my daughter. Our faces completely covered, trying to carry something much bigger than ourselves. See, most of that weight, I believe, exists because of sin. Like our own sin, the brokenness of this world, and the consequences of just living in fallen creation. But this is what the beautiful truth of the gospel is that Jesus came so our lives would no longer be crushed underneath the weight anymore. See, Jesus offers freedom and healing. He offers rest and forgiveness. These are all things that are promised in Christ. But the one thing I want us to understand today is that although he promises to take the weight of the things that crush us, he never promised that we would never carry anything again. See, there's actually a crucial moment in the Gospels where Jesus is having like a more straightforward conversation with his disciples. In Matthew 16:24, he tells them, if any of you want to be my followers, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. Now notice what Jesus is saying. See, to follow him isn't something that you do empty-handed after you lay whatever you have to lay down. To follow him means to give up your own way and pick up your cross. But what's interesting in this moment is that when Jesus first says these words to his disciples, he hadn't been crucified yet. The disciples weren't thinking about Easter. They weren't thinking about salvation. Chances are that when they heard cross, they probably thought about Rome's method of execution, about how it was only reserved for the worst criminals. They probably thought about the shame and eventual death it would lead to. You see, because when somebody was sentenced to crucifixion, they were often forced to carry the crossbeam they would die on through the towns for the public to see right when they were heading to their place of execution. It was a humiliating moment for the people. The cross had not become a symbol of hope by this point. It was a symbol of surrender and arrest. When we hear those words today, it may sound heroic because we have the symbolism now, but for the original audience, this is scary. Jesus is saying, this is what you have to do to follow me. I don't know about you guys, but if I was there, I'd be like, yeah, Jesus, that's kind of terrible. I don't know how I feel about this. He was telling his disciples, if you're going to follow me, your life can no longer be your own. It can no longer be based off of your own way. You don't choose how difficult the journey's going to be because it's not always going to be easy. We fast forward and we eventually see Jesus living the very words he spoke. He's arrested, he's put on trial, he's sentenced to crucifixion, beaten, humiliated, mocked, and then finally he receives his cross. But I want to highlight something that becomes so easy to miss when we talk about the story of Jesus. And it's that Jesus was not put up on a cross that was waiting for him at Golgotha, which is the place that he was crucified. It was actually given to him where he was sentenced in the courtyards. He had to carry that cross from the courtyards to the place of execution. See, historians estimate that the crossbeam alone weighed somewhere between 75 and 125 pounds, with the journey being like a third of a mile. Now, normally that would be like a 10-minute walk, maybe 7 if you're a city walker. You know what I'm talking about, right? But Jesus wasn't beginning this journey healthy. He wasn't strong in this moment. He had already endured unimaginable torture. And it was no longer the point where he was just facing excruciating death. He also now had to endure this difficult journey, not just to the cross, but with the cross. Amen. The one who told his disciples to carry their cross was now carrying his own. And at this point, every disciple he said that to were nowhere to be found. See, somewhere along the road to Golgotha, he was tired and so beaten that his body eventually gave out. He could no longer walk the cross any further. And it's at this point where we're introduced to today's hidden figure. Mark 15:21 says, a passerby named Simon, everybody say Simon, who was from Cyrene, was coming in from the countryside just then, and the soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. See, we're told that when Jesus could no longer carry the cross down the road, we're introduced to a man named Simon from Cyrene who was passing by, and out of all of the people that were out there, the soldiers decided to drag him in and make him carry the cross that Jesus wasn't able to in the moment. The book of Luke even says that as the soldiers did it, they made him carry the cross directly behind Jesus to follow him, meaning he couldn't just rush to the place where it had to go to and be out of his way. He had to follow the pace of Christ, the Christ who at the time was fatigued and beaten and slow. That's the pace that Simon had to follow. It was hard. It was excruciating. And the crazy part of it all, Simon never volunteered to do it. He was forced to. Being from Cyrene, he most likely was an out-of-towner who was just coming to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, which means that was simply his plan. Go here, celebrate Passover, go home. That's it. But the book of Luke says that as Simon was coming in, that was the moment where his plans were interrupted. Like, I find this interesting. It wasn't a couple days of Simon being in Jerusalem. As he was going in to start this journey of celebrating Passover, he was pulled in. And rather than celebrating God's deliverance over Israel in Exodus, he was now carrying the cross where Jesus, who would eventually be called a Passover lamb, would be placed. In this glimpse of a moment where we're told about Simon, I believe that more than just a short moment in history, what's being illustrated is a real picture of what Jesus meant when he told the disciples to give up their own way and take up their cross. Because there's a couple realities that we see as Simon took up the cross of Jesus. And the first is that the cross carries real weight. It's important we understand that this is not a symbolic moment for Simon. This cross was real. It was rough. It was heavy. It was splintered. It was public for all to see, and it was inconvenient. The public scrutiny that Jesus was in the midst of, Simon had now joined in the journey of. If this is how taking up the cross can really be, then that means that following Jesus is more than just your morning Bible reading with coffee. It's more than just a Sunday service where you sing your favorite song. It's more than just a Bible verse you put on your Instagram bio that if we're being honest and I ask you to recite it back to me, you may not be able to. You guys know what I'm talking about. To follow Jesus means to take up your cross. And what we see here is that carrying our cross isn't always polished. It's not always aesthetic. And it's definitely not always easy. As a matter of fact, it's costly. Because when you take up your cross, you're deciding to live in direct obedience to Jesus. Which means that we choose forgiveness rather than unforgiveness. We choose obedience rather than our own desires. We choose to serve others rather than just ourselves. And we choose to love even the most difficult of people. But if I can be real with you guys, sometimes these things are heavy. To forgive and love that person, to obey and trust in this plan when I want to do that thing, that's a heavy decision to make. And it doesn't feel good at all to do sometimes. But why? Because what we also learn from Simon is that the cross often requires what we wouldn't naturally choose. As a matter of fact, the majority of what Jesus requires from us goes completely against our flawed minds and against what our first instincts would be. This is why before he tells his disciples to take up their cross, he says, you have to give up your own way. Because if you're going to do it my way, you're not going to like it if you're trying to stay stuck in your own. Remember, Simon's itinerary for his day in Jerusalem wasn't to carry somebody's execution instrument. It wasn't to carry something that was only reserved for criminals. It wasn't to get in the heap of a mess with his bloodstained cross. He was just passing by. And had not the soldiers dragged him on, he probably would keep going on his merry way. See, what we see Simon doing is something that would not be done naturally. How do we know? Because he was in the midst of a crowd that was shouting for the crucifixion of Jesus in the midst of his suffering. All of those people, not one person bothered to help. When Jesus tells us to forgive, it's often during the times we'd rather stay bitter. When he tells us to serve, it's often in the times where we would rather be served. When we're told to surrender to his plans and will, it's usually in the moments where we would rather have all the control we can get. When we're told to de-escalate a situation, it's in the heat of the moment when we want to be more violent. And when we're told to love, it's usually at the times where some of us would rather stay salty. These are things we would naturally not choose for ourselves or others. Yet it's what the cross demands. When you're in the thick of it, living with the harsh realities of the cross, it can be very easy to question why you're still carrying something that doesn't seem to be bettering you in the here and now. Because honestly, sometimes it can feel that way. I mean, for Simon, there was no benefit for him in the moment. It costed him something. It was heavy. He got into the middle of the humiliation that Jesus was facing. Like, what good is there about the cross when that comes as part of the experience? See, it's important that in the heat of those experiences, we're not asking why we should carry this. Because honestly, if you can't find a good answer in the now, sometimes you can't. It'll feel very enticing to give the cross up. The question to be asking in this moment is not why I should keep carrying this, but rather, where is this thing leading me towards? See, because Simon was carrying the cross to a destination. And to the Romans, it was just another execution that they did. To Simon, it was an unexpected burden. But what neither of them fully understood was that in that moment, Simon was carrying a cross that had an eternal impact on humanity. It was the cross Simon carried that Jesus would die on, only to rise again 3 days later, defeating sin and death once and for all, providing salvation for all that believe and trust in him. I don't know about you guys, but that's a pretty big deal. Like, that's an insane part of history to say that you had the ability to participate in. And don't get me wrong, as great as this is, it doesn't discredit the burden that Simon held on to. His burden was real, but man, the destination he was heading towards, it makes it all worth it. Don't miss this. Simon carried Jesus' cross, but Jesus was carrying the weight of every sin humanity ever committed. Simon's journey led to Golgotha, but Jesus' journey was leading to salvation for all. Simon eventually put the cross down, but you know who had to stay on it? Jesus Christ. That's the gospel. That's the story. And that difference makes carrying the cross worth it. In your experience of carrying your cross, when it's easier to worry than to trust, when it's easier to revert rather than to obey, when it's easier to abandon rather than staying committed, don't choose what you'll carry based on how heavy it feels today, but rather choose what you'll carry based on where it leads you to tomorrow. Because every burden has a destination, even the ones that feel lighter. You see, the book of Mark actually gives us an interesting detail. When we're introduced to Simon, he includes that he's the father of Alexander and Rufus. And to us, it kind of doesn't make sense, like, okay, like random fun fact. But what I often tell my students is, even though the Bible is written for us, it wasn't originally written to us. Like, we're not the original audience. Mark's original audience likely knew this family. And it's almost as if Mark is saying, hey, this is the story of Simon. If you don't believe me, go ask Alexander. He'll tell you. Or go ask Rufus. He can validate these things. And while the Gospels would be the only time that Simon is ever mentioned, what we'll catch is that it wouldn't be the last time we hear of a man named Rufus. Paul writes a letter to the church in Rome, and near the end, he says in Romans 16:13, to greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who's been a mother to me also. Many scholars believe that Paul is literally referring to the Rufus, son of Simon, which means if this is true, Simon carrying Jesus' cross didn't have a momentary implication for his life. It had an eternal one on his family. It means that Simon eventually became a believer, which as a result transformed his entire home. It means that that one burden Simon had to carry created a generational change that impacted his entire family for the better. Amen. This is why the determining factor for whether something is worth carrying is where it leads. Because if that's the destination that he's on, and if that's the destination that I'm on, then we're going. We're doing it. Yeah. See, following Jesus isn't easy. Actually, he never said it would be. He actually assures us of the opposite. He says there will be trouble. You will have trials. You will deal with persecution. Difficulty will be a part of the journey. But in the middle of all of that, he also promises victory. Because every road that follows Christ, no matter how hard it is, it ends in life and in more life. See, I think sometimes this is where we get following Jesus wrong. We think following Jesus is simply how we interact with him in our habits, right? Like praying a prayer one day, reading our Bible every now and then, showing up to church on the weekends. And don't get me wrong, these are all good things. You should pray. We should read God's word. We should gather together as a church. But following Jesus has always been more than what you do for an hour on Sunday. It's about who you're following and how you're obeying every day of the week. See, Jesus didn't just say, believe in some things about me, or hey, spend a Sunday with me. He said, follow me. Simple as that. And following him means that there's going to be moments where he asks you to forgive when you would rather stay bitter. You choose the heavier thing. To trust when you'd rather worry. You choose the heavier thing. To surrender when you'd rather control. To love when you'd rather walk away. And ultimately to carry a cross when your flesh would rather carry your own desires. There's going to be days where this cross feels heavy. There's going to be days where your obedience will cost you something. It'll cost you relationships. It'll cost you opportunities. There's going to be days where you're tempted to ask, man, is this really worth it? But if I can remind you of this truth just one more time, do not judge the cross by today's weight. Judge it by where it's taking you. Because Jesus never said, I am the easy way, but he did say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Which means that every step you take following him, even the difficult ones, the ones that require you to stretch a little bit, the ones that cause you to stumble a bit, every step you take, no matter how hard it is, will always be a step toward life. That's why we don't abandon the cross when it gets heavy. Because yes, the road is difficult, but we're walking with the Lord who is life in of himself. See, maybe today the burden has gotten heavy for you. Life has happened, disappointment distracted you, pain has discouraged you, maybe fear has crept in. Maybe somewhere along the way you just stopped surrendering every part of your life to Jesus. You've picked up things that he's already asked you to lay down. Things like bitterness, fear, control, or self-reliance. Or maybe you've never actually surrendered your life to Jesus at all. Maybe you've known about him and you've been around church. Maybe you believe he exists, but you've never actually made a decision to follow him. Whether you've been following Jesus for years or have never followed him at all, the beautiful invitation for all of us today, in light of what we're talking about, is simply to come to Jesus. Because before Jesus ever says, take up your cross, he first says, come to me. Before Jesus ever asked us to carry our cross, he carried ours. That cross that Simon carried, it wasn't his. It was Jesus. And while Simon had to carry the burden of the weight of the cross, Jesus was carrying the burden of sin of the world. Think about that. The only person who ever lives without sin carried the weight of every sin ever committed. Your guilt, your shame, our failures, our rebellion, our past, and our future, the punishment that we deserve, Jesus willingly carried so that we would never have to in him. That's what makes following Jesus worth it. Not because the road is easy, but because the one leading us carried the greatest burden for us today. Worship team, you can come on up. The whole point of this isn't to say that you got to keep doing more, because following Jesus isn't about earning his love. It's simply about receiving it. He's not asking you to clean yourself up before coming to him. He's asking you to trust him. Trust him enough to surrender, to stop carrying what only he can carry. And maybe you spent a long time trying to earn God's approval, trying to outrun your past, trying to prove you're enough, trying to fix yourself in all sorts of ways, trying to carry shame that Jesus already paid for. Maybe you're carrying your life like a 1-year-old trying to carry a blue bin they have no business carrying. You know, after I watched Alora trying to carry that thing, you know what I didn't do? I wasn't like some coach in the corner saying like, arms up, you know what I mean? Like, try harder, like, go further, lift harder, figure it out. Like, I wasn't saying any of those things. I simply walked over and I took the burden off of her. Of course, after I got that picture. I'm not perfect. But I ended up helping her because I loved her too much to just sit there and wait and see if it could crush her or not. And that's exactly what Jesus has done for us. He looked at humanity. He saw us crushed beneath the weight of sin, unable to free ourselves. And instead of standing at a distance, shouting instructions from heaven like lift harder, do better, he stepped into our burden. He became one of us, a part of our world, and he put the burden on his own shoulders. And then he looked at all of us who are weary, broken, burdened, and rather than saying carry harder, in Matthew 11, he said, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. That's the invitation for today. Not try harder, not become better, simply come to Jesus. Because he carried the cross, he died the death we deserved, and 3 days later, he walked out of the grave so that anyone who comes to him can walk in freedom, forgiveness, new life, relationship with God, and eternity with him forever. Why don't we all stand? See, every single one of us came in carrying something, and every single one of us will leave this room carrying something. And my prayer today is that we all leave this room making the decision to carry the one burden that leads to life, which is the cross of Christ. These altars are open, so whether you need to lay something down or you need to pick the cross back up, come spend a few moments with Jesus as we sing this last song. Lay down what he's already carried for you. Stop doing the work you don't have to do and pick up what he's calling you to carry so that you can leave this place following the one man who can lead you to life and more life.